Welcome to another episode of Out from the Horrorbox. I'm your fanged host, Dom, and in this episode we're going to be going over the 1975 horror novel and second published novel from the author Stephen King, the story about a small town that becomes overrun by vampires, Salem's Lot. To give a fictional history of the town, Salem's Lot, which was short for Jerusalem's Lot, was incorporated in 1765. The name of the town came when Maine was still part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The town got its name from a myth about one of the earliest residents, Charles Belknap Tanner, who raised pigs. One of these pigs was named Jerusalem. One day, Jerusalem escaped from her confines into a nearby forest and became aggressive and wild. Tanner began warning young children who trespassed out on his property to keep ye out or Jerusalem's wood lot, lest the pig devour them. Eventually the phrase Jerusalem's Lot was adopted as the town's name. As we continue our path of the beam to the Dark Tower, we stop over in Salem's Lot to check out our first novel that connects to the tapestry of the Dark Tower series. While teaching a course on fantasy and science fiction at Hampton Academy, Stephen King found inspiration in Bram Stoker's Dracula, one of the texts discussed in the class. One evening during supper, he mused about what would happen if Dracula were to return in the 20th century, particularly in America. His wife, fellow novelist Tabitha King, quipped, "He'd probably be run over by a yellow cab on Park Avenue and killed." In the introduction to the 2004 audiobook recording, King himself recalls that he initially suggested probably he'd land in New York and be killed by a taxi cab like Margaret Mitchell in Atlanta. However, it was Tabitha who proposed a rule setting for the story, effectively closing the discussion. Yet, the idea lingered in King's mind, sparking his curiosity. He pondered, if the legendary count were to arrive in a bustling metropolis, what fate would await him? Conversely, he wondered what might unfold if he landed in a quiet, sleepy town. This contemplation led King to write Salem's Lot, originally titled Second Coming. Although he favored the latter title, Tabitha advised against it, suggesting it sounded too much like a bad sex story. The book was eventually titled Jerusalem's Lot before King's publisher shortened it to the current title, believing that the original sounded overtly religious. Ultimately, King's paperback publisher secured the novel for a staggering $550,000. King elaborates on his vision of the 20th century vampire in his essay for Adeline magazine titled On Becoming a Brand Name, which was published February 1980. He explains, "I began to turn the idea over in my mind, and began to coalesce into a possible novel. I thought it would make a good one. If I could create a fictional town with enough prosaic reality about it to offset the comic book menace of a bunch of vampires." However, the root of Salem's Lot traced back even further. In his nonfiction work, Dance Macabre, King recounts a vivid dream from his childhood. At just 8 years old, he dreamed of a hanged man's body swaying from a scaffold on a hill, a sign reading Robert Burns attached to it. But as the wind turned the corpse, he saw his own face, decayed and pecked by birds. The horror escalated when the corpse opened its eyes and stared at him. He woke, screaming, convinced that the dead face was looming over him in the dark. 16 years later, this haunting imagery resurfaced in Salem's Lot, with King altering the name of the corpse to Hubie Marston. King first explored the concept of Jerusalem's Lot in a short story penned during his college years, but was not unpublished until later in his collection Night Shift. In a 1969 column titled "The Garbage Truck," written for the University of Maine at Orono's campus newspaper, he foreshadowed the forthcoming novel by mentioning the mysterious disappearance of a sect of Shakers from the town of Jeremiah's Lot in Vermont during the early 1800s, a place that remains uninhabited to this day. The political climate of the early 1970s significantly influenced King's writing of Salem's Lot. He recalls the pervasive atmosphere of corruption during that era, particularly the unfolding revelations surrounding the Watergate scandal. I wrote Salem's Lot during the period when the Urban Committee was sitting. That was also when we first learned of the Ellsberg break-in, the White House tapes, the connections between Gordon Liddy and the CIA, and the existence of an enemies list, and a slew of other unsettling intelligence. King reflects on the feeling of dread that enveloped the nation, comparing it to the horror of faceless victims in the hands of a government rife with subterfuge. Every novel is, to some extent, an inadvertent psychological portrait of the novelist. He notes, the unspeakable obscenity in Salem's Lot mirrors my disillusionment and fear for the future. In a way, it's more akin to Invasion of the Body Snatchers than it is to Dracula. The true terror in Salem's Lot arises from the notion that the government has invaded the very essence of our lives. So with all that out of the way, let's get into what this novel is about. The novel opens with a prologue. A tall man and a young boy, who are apparently not father and son, are making their way across the country. The man supports them with odd jobs and checks the main newspapers for any news of the town of Salem's Lot, which he eventually finds in the form of a long article describing how a lot of the town's residents have relocated or simply vanished. The young boy decides he wants to join the priesthood, and the priest confronts the man about the insane things in the boy's confession, which the man says are all true. The man then asks the boy to return with him to Salem's Lot. Part 1. The Marston House. 32-year-old Ben Mears returns to Salem's Lot 25 years after he lived there as a boy, and 2 years after his wife Miranda was killed in a motorcycle accident. Ben's first move is to scope out the creepy town fixture of the Marston House. Then, in the park, he meets an attractive girl named Susan, who happens to be reading one of the novels Ben has written. Ben tells her about his childhood in the lot, including leaving shortly after his aunt's house burned down in the big town fire of '51. We get some history about the town, including that it was named after a pig, and it's so small it's isolated from most of the country's tragedies. Susan fights with her mother about Ben. She's been dating another man, Floyd Tibbetts, whom her mother prefers, before going to the movies with him. After which Ben tells her about the time he went into the Marston House, which has a famous history in the town because the rumored gangster Hubie Marston shot his wife there before hanging himself. Going in as a boy to impress some other boys, Ben claims he saw Hubie Marston still hanging in the master bedroom, and that Hubie opened his eyes before Ben fled. He admits he could have hallucinated it, believes that the house has some kind of monstrous psychic energy. He had wanted to rent the house upon his return, but someone had already bought it, and he and Susan can see apparent candlelight illuminating it from the porch of Ben's boarding house. We get a description of a long day in the lot, tracking different town members, including a groundskeeper, Mike Rayerson, finding the body of a dead dog hanging from the cemetery gates. The new young boy, Mark Petrie, besting a bully. The real estate agent, Larry Crockett, reflecting on the suspicious deal he made with the strange man named Straker, who bought the Marston house, and is opening an antique furniture store with his partner, Barlow. The high school English teacher, Matt Burke, noticing there's a car parked at the Marston house. Ben going to Sue's parents for dinner. The young brothers, Ralphie and Danny Glick, heading through the woods after dusk to visit Mark Petrie when they're accosted by something mysterious. And finally, a mysterious figure apparently making some kind of sacrifice. Danny returns home without Ralphie and can't remember what happened. And a few days later, Danny is hospitalized and dies of anemia. Straker calls in a service from Larry Crockett, who made a killing investing in trailer parks, to have some furniture delivered to the house. The men tasked with the delivery are overcome with fear as they drag a large piece of furniture down to the Marsden house cellar. One of them returns to Larry and says he thinks he might have seen a kid's clothes down there that might be Ralphie Glick's, but Crockett bribes him to ignore it. Constable Parkins Gillespie interrogates Ben about where he was when Ralphie disappeared, and Ben refuses to let Gillespie near his manuscript pages. Gillespie also questions Straker. Ben and Susan have sex in the park, after which point he finally explains that his book is about the Marston house, and that he's done a lot of research on Hubie Marston, who was a contract killer. Ben believes the house still contains Hubie's evil, especially since kids have started disappearing again now that the house is reoccupied. Ben then goes out to Dell's bar and ends up meeting Matt Burke, who talks to him about the Marsden house because he found out Ben was writing about it from the town librarian. After Danny Glick's funeral, Mike Ryerson is burying the coffin when he becomes convinced that Danny's eyes are open inside the coffin, and he eventually digs it up and sees that they are. A weird stranger visits Dud Rogers at the dump, and he runs, and Dud starts to feel hypnotized. Father Callahan, drunk again on a Sunday night, ponders the nature of evil. Matt and Ben have dinner together and keep discussing the Marsden house and Danny Glick's death. Matt goes to Dell's and runs into Mike Ryerson, who's very sick. So Matt lets him come home with him. That night, Matt hears Mike say, "Come in." And Matt is overcome by fear as he hears the laugh of a child and sucking sounds. Part 2. The Emperor of Ice Cream. Matt calls Ben to his house, asking him to bring a crucifix, and they debate whether Mike is dead. Matt voices his vampire suspicions, and Ben says people will think he's crazy, so they call in the constable and medical examiner to make their own determination, fudging what really happened. Matt, Ben, and Susan are planning to visit the Marsden house that day when Ben is attacked by Floyd Tibbetts and has to be hospitalized. Susan argues with her mother, who thinks Ben is bad news and has something to do with all the weird stuff going on. When she shows Susan a tabloid claiming Ben was drunk at the time of the motorcycle accident that killed his wife, Susan says she's moving out. Ben sends Susan to Matt's house, and Matt tells her what happened with Mike. They hear a noise upstairs, and Matt goes up to see Mike rise, then banishes him out the window with the crucifix. Matt has a heart attack. Sandy McDougal wakes the next morning to find her baby Randy dead. Ben and Susan debate what really happened at Matt's house. Floyd Tibbetts dies in jail. Corey Bryant visits Bonnie Sawyer to carry on their affair when Bonnie's husband shows up and threatens to kill Corey. When Corey finally leaves, he runs into Barlow. Some bodies have disappeared from the morgue, and the undead Danny Glick visits Mark Petrie, who staves him off with a cross. Ben convinces Dr. Jimmy Cody to exhume Danny Glick, but when they try to get permission from the Glick parents, they find out that they've died. In the meantime, Susan decides to go out to the Marsden house by herself, where she runs into Mark Petrie. Jimmy and Ben sit with Marjorie Glick's body, and when night falls, she rises and attacks them. biting Jimmy before Ben banishes her with a cross. Jimmy douses his wound with vodka, which somehow staves off the effects. They make up a story about what happened when they talk to Sheriff McCaslin. Mark and Susan see Straker leave the house before they break in, but then Straker is inside and knocks Mark out and ties him up in the attic. Using Houdini as an inspiration, Mark manages to free himself and bashes Straker in the head with a bed leg when Straker returns. Mark tries to go down to the cellar to get Susan, but Barlow is down there with her, and Mark flees. That night, Susan visits him as a vampire, but he refuses to let her in. Father Callahan visits Matt, and they debate about the supernatural and the changing concept of evil in the Catholic Church. Part 3. The Deserted Village. Lots more town people are getting sick. Susan attacks Sheriff McCaslin and her parents. Mark tells Ben that what happened to Susan, and Mark, Ben, Jimmy, and Father Callahan make plans to confront Barlow. Ava Miller notices a weird smell in the cellar of her boarding house where Ben's been staying. Father Callahan hears everyone's confessions, so they'll be pure for their confrontation with Barlow. When they get to the Marston house, Callahan tries to banish the evil with the cross, and there's a weird light and the windows blow out. Inside, Straker's hanging upside down and bled out, and Barlow's left a letter for them saying he's going to kill them. They go to the cellar, where Ben stakes Susan. Callahan and Mark go to Mark's parents, while Ben and Jimmy go back to Matt at the hospital. At Mark's, Barlow attacks and kills Mark's parents. Callahan gets him to let Mark go by agreeing to let go of his cross, and Barlow makes Callahan drink blood. Ann Norton visits the hospital with a gun, but is stopped, then dies. Ben and company debate where Barlow is hiding now that his house has been compromised. Father Callahan, now unclean so he can't enter a church, buys a bus ticket out of town and some liquor to go with it. The school bus driver wakes up to kids vandalizing his bus that turn out to be vampires. Corey Bryant returns as a vampire to Bonnie's to take his revenge. The next day, Jimmy, Ben, and Mark visit Barlow and Straker's shop, now closed, and find Mike Rayerson's body. Ben makes stakes at Mark's house while Mark and Jimmy try to find the vampires' daytime hiding places, and they go to the McDougalls, exposing the father's body and making him writhe but letting him return to the shadows. They realize from chalk Mark saw on Barlow's fingers that he's in Ava Miller's boarding house basement, where there's a pool table. A former student visits Matt at the hospital and witnesses Matt's heart attack and death. Jimmy and Mark go to the boarding house, where Jimmy falls into a trap set by the vampires, who remove the cellar stairs and put a bunch of knives on the bottom. Mark manages to escape and gets Ben. They get holy water from the church and return to Ava's, finding Barlow's case in the cellar. Ben hacks it open with an axe, and Barlow looks into Mark's eyes, causing Mark to attack Ben and almost shoot him. But Ben overcomes him and manages to drive a stake into Barlow, destroying him. The other vampires come out, but can't touch Mark and Ben because of their holy water. After Ben burns his manuscript, he and Mark leave Salem's Lot. In the epilogue, strange stories from Salem's Lot continue, and Ben and Mark return to the town. They go to the place where the famous fire of 51 started, and Ben starts a fire to drive out the remaining vampires. Okay, well, Stephen King wrote 2 tie-in short stories to the novel Salem's Lot. They were both printed in Night Shift and included in the 2005 illustrated edition of the novel Salem's Lot. The first story is actually a prequel story called Jerusalem's Lot, set in the fictional town of Preacher's Corners in 1850. The story is told through a series of letters and diary entries, mainly from the main character, aristocrat Charles Boone. although his manservant, Calvin McCann, also occasionally assumes the role of narrator. So Charles Boone, in letters addressed to Bones, describes the arrival of himself and his manservant, Calvin McCann, at Chapel Waite, the neglected ancestral home of Charles' estranged late cousin Stephen. Calvin learns that many people in the nearby main town of Preacher's Corners think Charles and Calvin are mad for living in the mansion. The house is said to be a bad house, with a history of sad events, disappearances, and mysterious noises, which Charles attributes to rats in the walls. Calvin finds a hidden compartment in the library containing an old map of a deserted village called Jerusalem's Lot, a mysterious area the townsfolk avoid. Their curiosity piqued, Charles and Calvin set out to explore the village. The two find a decayed Puritan settlement. Nothing, including animals, has set foot in the town since its abandonment. Exploring a church, they discover an obscene parody of the Madonna and Child and an inverted cross. At the pulpit, they find a book filled with Latin and Druidic ruins entitled De Verimis Mysteriis, or The Mysteries of the Worm. When Charles touches the book, the church shakes and something gigantic moves in the ground beneath. The two flee the village. The Preacher's Corners inhabitants begin fearing Charles. They chase him from one house with rocks and guns. Charles asks Mrs. Cloris, Chapel Waite's former maid, for information about Jerusalem's Lot. She reveals a rift in Charles' family caused by his grandfather, Robert Boone, trying to steal De Verimis Mysteriis from his brother, Philip, presumably to destroy it. Philip was a minister involved in the occult who, on October 31st, 1789, vanished along with the population of Jerusalem's Lot. Charles dismissed it as superstition, but cannot forget what he saw in the church. Calvin discovers a diary in the library, encrypted with a rail fence cipher. Before he can decipher it, Charles takes him into the cellar to check for rats. Hidden behind the walls, they find the undead corpses of two of his relatives, Marcella and Randolph Boone. Charles recognizes them as Nosferatu. The two flee the cellar, and Calvin seals the trapdoor. As Charles recovers from the encounter, Calvin cracks the cipher. The diary written by Robert Boone details the history of Jerusalem's Lot and the events leading to the mass disappearance. The village was founded by one of Charles' distant ancestors, James Boone, who was the leader of an inbred witchcraft cult. Philip and Robert took up residence in Chapel Waite. Philip was taken in by Boone's cult and acquired De Verimis Mysteriis at Boone's behest. Philip and Boone used the book to call forth a supernatural entity referred to as the Worm. In his final entry, Robert curses the whippoorwill birds that have descended upon Chapel Waite. Charles feels compelled to return to Jerusalem's Lot. Calvin tries to stop him, but finally relents and accompanies his master. They discover a butchered lamb on the church altar, lying on top of De Verimis Mysteriis. Charles moves the lamb and takes the book to destroy it, but a congregation of undead appears, including Philip and Boone. Charles becomes possessed and begins chanting, summoning forth the Worm. Calvin knocks down Charles, freeing him from possession. Charles sets fire to the book. The Worm lashes out from below, killing Calvin before disappearing. Before Charles can recover Calvin's body, Boone forces Charles to flee. In his final letter to Bones, Charles announces his intention to commit suicide, ending the Boone family line. An editor's note attributes Charles' letters and the death of Calvin to insanity rather than supernatural occurrences in Jerusalem's Lot. The editor notes that Charles was not the last of his line. A bastard relative still exists. The editor himself, James Robert Boone, who has moved to Chapel Waite to restore the family name. James notes that Charles was right about one thing. The place badly needs the services of an exterminator. There's some huge rats in the walls, by the sound. The note is dated October 2nd, the same day as Charles' first letter. The second story, a sequel story, called One for the Road, is set 2 years after the events of Salem's Lot, the novel. Vampires still prowl the burned-out remains of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine, and its environs. Residents of nearby towns, including the narrator Booth, live in unspoken fear, wearing religious symbols for protection and never venturing near the area. One night, Booth and his friend, bar owner Herb Tooklander, attempt to rescue the wife and daughter of a motorist named Gerald Lumley, whose vehicle is stranded in a ferocious blizzard. Initially contemptuous of Lumley for driving in such bad weather, both are horrified upon realizing that his vehicle is stranded in Jerusalem's Lot. They reluctantly drive out in an international scout with Lumley to try to save his family, fearing the worst. The three locate Lumley's Mercedes, still running and heated but nonetheless abandoned. Realizing what has likely happened to Lumley's family, Tookie and Booth try to get him to leave with them to find the sheriff, but Lumley refuses and stumbles around in the snow, calling for his wife and daughter. Lumley's wife emerges from the dark, and he hurries towards her. He notices her fanged teeth and red eyes too late, and is bitten. Booth nearly falls victim to Lumley's daughter, but Tookie throws a Dowey Bible at her as both men scramble into the scout, quickly fleeing the area. Booth concludes the story by saying Tookie died of a heart attack a couple of years after the incident. He mentions that he still has nightmares about that night and about Lumley's daughter, and warns the reader that if they are in the area, to never go up the road into Jerusalem's Lot for any reason, especially at night, lest the reader encounter Lumley's daughter, still waiting for her goodnight kiss. Now, just like many of Stephen King's novels, short stories, novellas, Salem's Lot has been adapted and then adapted and adapted again, and even had kind of like a spin-off series that's actually based off of the short story Jerusalem's Lot. But let's get into the many adaptions. Eventually I'm going to cover the Stephen King films. But for now, I'm just going to kind of lightly touch on them. In 1979, Salem's Lot was adapted into a 3-hour, 2-part television miniseries that aired on CBS, starring David Soul as Ben Mears. This adaptation received critical acclaim, earning nominations for 3 Primetime Emmy Awards as well as an Edgar Award for its captivating storytelling. It was filmed on location in the picturesque town of Ferndale, California. The miniseries effectively captured the eerie essence of King's original work. Interestingly, a truncated 2-hour version was also released in cinemas in certain countries, showcasing the story's broad appeal. Then in 1987, director Larry Cohen took a different approach with A Return to Salem's Lot, which was marketed as a sequel to the 1979's miniseries. However, the film diverged significantly from its predecessor by omitting any original characters, despite using the image of Barlow from the earlier adaptation on its promotional poster. And then we move forward to 2004, and that's when TNT premiered a new television adaptation of Salem's Lot. And again, it was a 3-hour, 2-part miniseries. This time it featured Rob Lowe as Ben Mears. Like its predecessor, this adaptation garnered critical recognition and earned a Primetime Emmy nomination. In 2018, the 8th episode of the Castle Rock TV series, set in the fictional universe created by Stephen King titled Past Perfect, included a nod to Salem's Lot by briefly depicting a present-day bus stop in Jerusalem's Lot. A traffic sign indicated that the town was just 24 miles away from Castle Rock, further entwining the two narratives. Additionally, in the second season, the Marsden House played a significant role to that storyline that they set up. And honestly, I really liked that season. That was a pretty good season of Castle Rock. Was only 2 seasons. I think the second season was a lot stronger, but they had to go all out, a lot further away from just Castle Rock, I think, to make it a little bit more interesting. And then more recently in 2021, Epix developed the television series Chapelwaite, which starred Adrian Brody and Emily Hampshire, and was inspired by the short story Jerusalem's Lot, and that serves as a prequel to Salem's Lot, and it's set in the 19th century. And I heard it was actually really good, and I think they might have canceled it, though. I think it was only like 1 season, maybe, or 2. But also, there was talk of a new film adaptation back as far back as, I think, like 2019. So it was announced by New Line Cinema in April 2019 with Gary Doberman attached to write and direct, and James Wan was set to produce. The filming commenced in Boston in September 2021, featuring Lewis Pullman as Ben Mears, alongside Spencer Treat Clark, Mackenzie Lee in supporting roles as Mike Ryerson and Susan Norton, respectively. Although the film was originally slated for release in cinemas on September 9th, 2022, so 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, it faced many delays, and ultimately being pulled from Warner Brothers' release schedule indefinitely. However, fans can now watch it as it premiered, as I've been recording today, October 3rd, 2024. And that's something that I had talked about before, with David Zaslav, whatever his name is, coming in and changing a bunch of things around with Max, Discovery, this and that, and, kind of merging things and dropping things and getting rid of things. We weren't sure that this was ever going to come out. Finally, it premiered. I'm going to be watching it this weekend. Maybe I'll do a review of it a little later. Maybe I'll talk about it on TikTok. We now get to that part of the podcast where I give my final thoughts on Salem's Lot. I remember reading Salem's Lot. I don't even remember. It's been a long time since I went back and actually read it. Because I only read it once, and I remember I really liked it a lot. I thought, because of all, I think I was trying to read them in order. Because I didn't start in order. I was kind of jumping around, but then I was like, you know what? I gotta start reading these one after another in some kind of order. So I got Salem's Lot and I read it, and I was like, man, this is so good. What I liked about the novel a lot is, even though it is set in the 70s, right? And there's references to things. If you dropped a cell phone right into this person's pocket, it could be set now. That's what I really liked about at least the way he wrote this novel, Stephen King. It feels very timeless. You could that. I think that's why it's very easy to adapt, is because it does set it feel Dracula in the 20th century, 21st century. And honestly, I really like this one. I think this is one of his better novels. When it comes to Stephen King, there's where I consider his standout. They're above all. They're gonna be great no matter what. Then there's these really good ones that are solid. He's got some pretty good ones. He's got some ones that are they're fine. Then he's got the ones that are just okay, I can't. I don't know how I got through this. I can't go back and read it again. But this one is, I would say, maybe a solid A tier. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I'll just say right now, one of his not so good ones, like The Regulators or like the Tommyknockers, especially when he tries to do sci-fi. I think that's when it starts getting like, you should probably not do that. But then when he does something like this, where he sticks to being something like a little bit more traditional, and you can kind of see this is where he like starts. This is his second published novel, and you can see like the groundwork of like, oh, it's like a group of people coming together in like a. This is where I would say the connections of like the Dark Tower, like a group that has to come together, band together to defeat a common evil. And it could be in like a small town. It could be in a setting where, you know, like they're familiar with or maybe not familiar with. Then, you know, things start happening. And like that's usually kind of his, you know, status like quo for his novels like going forward, where you'll have, I mean, sometimes you'll have like the single person or one person trying to defeat everything or stop everything, like The Shining or Carrie, like Cujo. But then you have like groups of people having to like come together and face this evil, like this, It, and then like the Dark Tower, obviously. But I mean, like the descriptions of the vampires pretty good. I think Barlow as a character is really good. I think he stands out really well. I love that they talk about, I think that, like, I don't know if it's in here specifically, but they talk about like the way that the vampires look, or more like I think Barlow is more like an elder vampire, so I think he has like more like the sharper fangs, and like it's not just like the two fangs. And I love that he kept a lot of like that lore from Dracula. I started reading Dracula. I tried to read it. I could not get into it too much. But if it's anything like this, then I mean, I don't know why I couldn't get into it. I just feel like, you know, reading someone's letters and stuff was just a little whatever. But I will say that like I said, this is such a good one, and it's very important to the Dark Tower. Let's just get into that right now. Like I said, like that kind of idea of like a group of people coming together called, and I'm going to start like giving out terms from the Dark Tower, so we're set before we get there, because once we get there, we're going to start going through it, and we're going to start getting through it really heavy. I'm probably going to go over a lot of it again, but like, so now, like, if you're listening to this and you start with this, you can start getting some of these terms learned, like a quartet. That's where a group of people come together and they have a common goal. That's what you see in here, you know, with Ben, with Mark, Susan, all of them coming together to defeat Barlow and the vampires. And then the vampires themselves are very important. The vampires work for a greater evil we will learn in the Dark Tower series. And then one character who we will see pop up, and I'm just going to go ahead and say he will pop up again. It's not really a spoiler, because if you know anything about the Dark Tower series, they come up at a certain point, and he's very important to it. Father Callahan comes back. That's why Stephen King did want to write a sequel to this, but then once he got further into the Dark Tower series and brought Father Callahan back and told the story between then and the Dark Tower at that time, he said he felt like he'd written the sequel to Salem's Lot that he always wanted to. But yeah, like I said, 100% pick up this book. If you want to listen to the audiobook, listen to it. Watch the miniseries. That's actually directed by Toby Hooper, I'm pretty sure. And the new one, like I said, I'm going to watch it. I'll let you guys know, probably on my TikTok. I'll probably give like a spoiler-free review on there. But yeah, like I said, this is probably, if I have to give it any kind of stars, I'd probably give it 3.5 stars. Like, it's a solid, good book. Like, from beginning to end. It's not like I feel like it doesn't like try to do too much. It doesn't try to be more so, but I love that it introduces vampires into his like universe. Like, and it's the second book too, like his second published book, because like Carrie doesn't really connect. I mean, you could kind of say she has like The Shining, and we'll get to that. But this one is where he comes back later and is like, oh yeah, this book, it's actually really important. And that's what one thing that I love is that, you know, he kind of does that with every once in a while. He'll be like, hey, you remember this book? Yeah, it was actually really important to the story. Oh, remember that book? Oh yeah, it was actually really important. Remember that short story? Oh, it was actually kind of important to read. And it's like, it's what I like to think of it is like when we got to Infinity War, and then especially in Endgame when we got to like the time travel, and they were like, hey, so you remember Thor: The Dark World? How you guys didn't like it and you guys hated it? Yeah, it's actually really important to the story. And man, I really love that the Russo brothers did that. Just they could have made any of the other movies like more important, but they made that one like one of the most important movies of all of them, and it's one that everybody was like, oh, what? I hate this one, and I really like that. But I mean, it's not like with this, but like you will see he will go back and be like, hey, remember that one? Yeah, you rube. You should have been reading it the whole time. And then there's somewhere he'll be like, it was meant to be part of the series, or not part of the series, but like meant to be read. And then he'll be like, yeah, you can forget about that. But yeah, like you said, you want a vampire story, a good vampire story that's not freaking Twilight or anything like that, and you want one that's Stephen King, and he does that thing where he starts talking about a character and he kind of goes off a little bit. It's so funny because like I'm catching up with the Dark Tower right now, and I'm listening to the audiobooks again, and I just got to the Wasteland. It's so funny. I love when it's annoying, but I love it too because it's ridiculous when he starts talking about a character and he goes off and this they did this and they had a whole life and they did that and this is the reason why they do this. Oh yeah, by the way, getting back to the story, but Stephen King's just a great author, and that's the first beat on the path to the Dark Tower on the beam. Next up, we'll probably get to The Stand. Do you like vampires? Would you want to be turned into a vampire? What kind of vampire would you be? I know I'd be a sexy vampire. We want to thank you all for listening, and if you like what you hear, please subscribe to get every new episode downloaded. Do you have any personal or fictional, paranormal, supernatural, or unexplainable stories? We'd love to read them on the podcast. Please send your stories, recommendations, or anything else to horrorboxpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to show more support, you can follow our socials on Instagram, Threads, or TikTok @horrorboxpodcast. Also, you can buy me a coffee at coffee.com/horrorboxpodcast. It really helps out. Until next time, if someone is knocking at your window, don't invite them inside. This is Dom, signing off from the Horrorbox.